Hi, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology audio series learning module number 14. This module covers the subject of human reproduction, and the chapters that I would like you to read in order to be prepared for class are chapters 26 and 27. Keep in mind that there may or may not be a quiz over this material when you get to class next time we meet, and in addition to that, everything that is in this module is fair game for exams. All right, so genetics crash course. We don't have a lot of time to really go into genetics, unfortunately. But let's review what we already know and then talk a little bit more about genetics. So let's go back to the beginning of the course. All tissues are made up of cells, right? And so, for instance, on the right there, that's actually a cross-section of the kidney, I believe. And those cells that are surrounding the little tubes or the open spaces there are the cells that line the nephron, and that is epithelial tissue, by the way. So if you look at those cells, you look at the dark purple circles in the middle of each one of those cells. Those are the nuclei. And in the nuclei, plural is nuclei, singular is nucleus. In the nucleus, that's where you find the DNA. So you should already know that. Remember that DNA contains the genes, and it is the genes that code for protein. So how is the DNA packaged? The DNA is in the nucleus of each of your cells, or most of your cells. It is wound up in a structure called a chromosome. So let's look at the chromosome here. You can see that this is just a cartoon, right? So this isn't realistic. But if you were to unravel the chromosome, you would see that there's a bunch of DNA in there. DNA is a molecule. Remember that DNA is composed of nucleotides, and that there are 4 different kinds of nucleotides, A, C, G, and T, that you find in DNA. And all that DNA is wound up in those chromosomes. Don't worry about the telomere, P-arm, centromere, Q-arm, telomere. Don't worry about that. We don't have to know those terms. Okay, cells can either be diploid, that is, they have 2 copies of the DNA, or they can be haploid, that is, they have 1 copy of the DNA. Most cells in your body are diploid. So you may be aware that you and I, as human beings, have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Other organisms may have more or less, right? You know, cabbages have so many, and fruit flies have 4, and dogs have, a certain number. But humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So here they are all laid out. So let's look at them for a minute. So this is showing you, this is called a karyotype, and it's showing the pairs of chromosomes as they would be in your nucleus, but they laid them out for a photograph, right? So notice they're numbered, so you have chromosome number 1, chromosome number 2, chromosome number 3, etc. Notice that there are 2 copies of each. This is because you have 23 pairs of chromosomes in most of your cells. So notice chromosome 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice that the pairs all look alike. They all look pretty much alike. You got one of them, incidentally, from your mother and one of them from your father. And then notice that there's 1 pair of chromosomes called the XY chromosomes, and that pair is what determines whether or not you are a male, biologically a male or a female. And notice if you are male, you have one of those Y chromosomes. If you are a female, you'll actually have 2 X chromosomes that will look exactly the same, just like all the other pairs. Okay, so that's all the chromosomes laid out. So if you had 40, so this is 46 total chromosomes. This is the diploid number. Okay? If you only had 23, that would be haploid. You would only have half the number of chromosomes. Along the chromosomes are segments of DNA that code for proteins. We've talked about this several times in the past. These segments of DNA are called genes. So if you look at the diagram below, you can look at, to the left, you'll see a cell. And of course, the chromosomes are hanging out, as you know, in the nucleus of the cell. Then if you look at one chromosome, which is in the middle of the diagram, and then if you look at the right of the diagram, there is a segment, it's blown, like a piece of the chromosome has been removed, and you can see that there's a molecule of DNA. A section of a molecule of DNA, so a sequence of nucleotides that codes for a protein, that's the important part there, is called a gene. We talked a little bit about how cells make their own proteins using the recipe in DNA. So there are genes that are recipes for certain proteins. For example, there's a gene for insulin. Insulin is a protein. That gene is in all of your cells, but it's only expressed in, or in most of your cells, I should say, but it's only expressed, that is, it's only translated in the pancreas cells that make insulin. So the recipe is always there. The recipe is in all the cells, but only the certain pancreas cells that make insulin, only those cells are going to actually translate that gene into protein and make insulin. Liver. The liver makes albumin. Some of the liver cells make albumin. The liver cells that make albumin, which is a protein, the recipe for albumin is in the DNA. There's a gene for albumin. It's in the DNA. It's in the DNA of most of your cells, but only in those liver cells that produce albumin is that gene expressed. So those liver cells will make albumin. Collagen is another protein we've discussed. Fibrin is another protein we've discussed. Antibodies, those are other proteins that we've discussed. Enzymes, digestive enzymes, those are all proteins. Certain hormones, like insulin, we just mentioned, are proteins. So there are a whole, channels and receptors, and cells need to make their own proteins. So the recipe for all of those proteins is found in the DNA, and the gene, there's particular genes that code for certain proteins, and the cells will use the process of protein synthesis to make those proteins. In fact, the cell spends a lot of its day doing that, making proteins from the recipe in DNA. All right, so a mutation is a change in a gene or a chromosome that results in a unique feature or birth defect. So, for example, UV light is something that can mutate DNA. And how it does that is it just changes the sequence. It changes the sequence of nucleotides in the DNA. And any change to the DNA is called a mutation. And there's certain things that can cause the mutations, but a lot of mutations just occur randomly. Mutations can occur due to mutagens, such as UV light, chemical toxins. Many just occur randomly. Most mutations are either corrected or happen in junk DNA and do not happen in a gene. So in your chromosomes, there are only certain segments of the DNA that are actually genes. The rest of it, either we don't know what it does or it does nothing. But we call that, or we used to call it junk DNA. I don't think we really call that anymore because we're finding that it's not really junk. But if a mutation occurs in the DNA that does not code for a protein, then it doesn't matter, right? So a lot of mutations occur in places on the DNA where it doesn't matter. As long as it doesn't alter a gene, it's no big deal. If by the unlucky chance that the mutation happens in a gene, this can cause a problem. If the gene in question is a gene whose products control cell division, cancer can occur. So mutations can lead to cancer, but there has to be a very specific course of events that occurs in order for cancer to actually happen. If mutations occur while a fetus is developing, a birth defect can occur. Cells need to make copies of themselves for growth and repair. When they do this, they need to make a copy of their DNA. Then the cell divides. This process is called mitosis. The result of mitosis is two cells that are copies of the original cell. Since the original cell is diploid, the daughter cells are also diploid. Okay, so this is going to walk you through the process of mitosis. You do not need to know all the different phases. You may have learned that in the past. You don't have to. All I'm interested in, if you look at this diagram and you put your hand up in the middle and you cover everything in the middle up, so that's all that's left is the first cell and the last two cells. That's basically what I want you to know about mitosis. You start with one cell and you end with two. The other important part, though, is that you start with one cell and you end with two cells that are exact copies of the first cell. This is mitosis. When does it happen? It happens during growth. You started out as one cell, now you're 100 trillion cells, right? How did all those cells get there? They got there through mitosis. You cut yourself and your skin has to heal. What's going on there? Mitosis. Mitosis is cell division. It's just cells making copies of themselves. That's all it is. Okay, so watch the video and that will help you hopefully just shed a little more light on the process of mitosis. All right, so that was mitosis that I hopefully you watched in the video. So the other process you need to be aware of is meiosis. And meiosis occurs in the far-off land of the testicles and the ovaries. This is the only place meiosis happens. And the process of meiosis is the process of making sperm in the male and making eggs in the female. It's as simple as that. It's not more complicated than that. Everywhere else in your body, mitosis is going on. But in your testes, if you're a male, and in your ovaries, if you're a female, eggs and sperm are made by the process of meiosis. It's as simple as that. Another thing to remember about meiosis, though, is that in mitosis, you're making an exact copy. Well, in meiosis, the process is a little different, and what you end up with is cutting the amount of DNA in half. So the cells, certain cells in your ovaries, start out diploid, but through the process of meiosis, they end up haploid, so they end up with half the amount of DNA. So in a human, these cells start out with 46 chromosomes and end up with 23. Okay? You may have to repeat that several times, but it's really simpler than you think. You can watch the process of meiosis. You're not responsible for the different stages or anything. You just need to know that meiosis happens in the in the ovaries and the testes, and results in eggs and sperm. And it results in a cell. The eggs and the sperm are cells that have half the amount of DNA. Or, in humans, 23 chromosomes apiece. Okay, so this brings us to fertilization. So the egg and the sperm are made in the ovaries and the testes. When a male and female copulate, the sperm fertilizes the egg. And if you think about it, it makes sense now that you have a haploid sperm and a haploid egg with 23 chromosomes each. because when they come together in the process of fertilization, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, now the first cell that's produced from that union has 2 copies again, right? Think about it, because this is an important concept. The sperm has 23 chromosomes, the egg has 23, they come together, now you have 46 again. And those 46 chromosomes are going to be a new individual. And that new individual, the first cell, the very first cell that every single person that's watching this was once one cell. That one cell is called the zygote. That first cell is called the zygote. The zygote is now diploid, and the zygote will undergo mitosis. Mitosis now, right? Think about it. Mitosis to form the embryo, and then the fetus, and then eventually the full-grown human being, all through the process of mitosis, okay? So here is a lovely picture of the female reproductive system, because this is where fertilization takes place. You have the ovary. Find the ovary. You have the fallopian tube. It's this long tube that's associated with the ovary. The ovary isn't actually attached to this tube, by the way, but we'll look at a better picture later. And then you have the uterus, which is half of it is pictured at the right. So let me call your attention to the ovary. So inside the ovary, through the process of meiosis, an egg is made. That egg is then released into the fallopian tube through the process of ovulation. So that little pink dot is released into the fallopian tube. I'm sorry, it's the big purple circle. So the big purple circle is released into the fallopian tube. It's now called the oocyte in this picture. That process is called ovulation, when that egg is released into the fallopian tube. Okay, so in this case, obviously, sexual intercourse has occurred because there's some sperm that come into the picture and fertilize the egg. So you can see that. The sperm are the little purple dots with the tails. Okay, and then they come together and they form the zygote, which is the fertilized egg. And then the cell starts dividing through mitosis. So day 1, day 2, day 3 or 4, this more and more cells through mitosis. Don't worry about the names of these things. You don't need to know that. But they have different names depending on what stage they're in. By the time you get to day 8 or day 9, down there at the bottom, notice that the developing embryo is implanted in the uterus. Okay, so the egg was released into the fallopian tubes, it got fertilized, then it went through mitosis, and now it's implanted in the uterus. Just to give you an idea, at this stage, the embryo is the size of a poppy seed. By day 8 or 9, very, very tiny. In 8 weeks, it will be about the size of a grape, just to give you a sense of how tiny it is. So when the embryo is implanted in the uterus, it is the size of a poppy seed. Okay, this is a wonderful video that you need to watch. This is on fertilization. Everybody needs to watch it. It's about the heroic journey of the sperm to go fertilize the egg. It's a very interesting video, one of my very favorites to watch. A lot happens along the journey as the sperm goes to fertilize the egg. It's pretty amazing, actually. The odds are against the sperm actually making it, and only one does, unless there's twins, of course, in which case sometimes 2 or 3 even make it to fertilize the eggs. So the endometrium is the innermost layer of the uterus. So if you look over there to the right, the endometrium is the inside of the uterus where the embryo is implanted. It's also the part of the uterus that sloughs off during menstruation. So when females have their periods, what's happening is that the endometrium is actually sloughing out of the body, and that is why you have so much blood, because the endometrium is full of blood because it was preparing itself for the implantation of the embryo. And when that didn't happen, then the endometrium sheds, and the process begins all over again. Notice that there's also a layer of the endometrium called the myometrium. The myometrium is smooth muscle, right? Because if you think about it, the uterus, where the embryo is going to actually develop into the baby eventually, right? Into the fetus, the myometrium is smooth muscle because when females go into labor, they start to feel those contractions. Why do you think they're called contractions? They're called contractions because that's muscle contraction, smooth muscle. Definitely not something you can control, right? The contractions just happen. This is autonomic, right? This is controlled by your autonomic nervous system. The contractions of the myometrium, which is smooth muscle, not skeletal, right? All right, returning to the ovary. After meiosis, the egg is found inside a follicle. So let's look at the diagram. Okay, so this is showing you over time what's going on inside the ovary. So we'll start, you don't have to know most of these terms, so don't let that scare you. There's a few terms you have to know. Start with the primary follicle at the left. And then you do have to know the term follicle. So after meiosis, the egg is found inside something called a follicle. So then the follicle develops some more. It gets bigger, right? And then when you reach the right side of the ovary in this diagram, the bottom right, notice that the egg then is released into the fallopian tube, which is not pictured, but the egg is released by the follicle. Once the egg is released, don't worry about all these terms, I'll tell you the terms you need to know. Once the egg is released, the follicle develops into something called the corpus luteum. This is something you do need to know. The corpus luteum then is a very important structure in the ovary, so we are going to discuss it later. Okay, so that's pretty much what you need to know as far as the ovary is concerned. After meiosis, right, the egg is found inside a follicle. The follicle develops, ovulation occurs, and then the follicle itself becomes something called the corpus luteum. All right, so FSH and LH, remember them from our discussion of the endocrine system. FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone is LH. And the follicle, of course, in follicle stimulating hormone is the follicle that we just discussed. Luteinizing hormone is the corpus luteum that we just discussed. It is LH, luteinizing hormone, that stimulates, it's the production of LH that stimulates ovulation. FSH stimulates maturation of the egg and the follicle. Okay, so LH also maintains the corpus luteum. For a little while, progesterone and estrogen are released from the ovary. So FSH and LH are released from the anterior pituitary gland in response to the hypothalamus. And the ovary then secretes estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone feed back, remember that, on the pituitary and decrease the secretion of FSH and LH. So notice in this picture of the ovary, same story, right? You have the follicle, and the follicle is being maintained by the FSH, releases the egg, and then develops into the corpus luteum. All right, so this is the female reproductive cycle. It's pretty complicated. Everything that you need to know I've written in bold, but the diagrams can be very, very helpful. All right, so notice the thing to notice. So let's look at, we'll talk about what you have to know, but let's look at the diagram for a minute. So the top, there's A, B, C, and D. A is showing you how the hormones change over the course of 28 days. So a female menstrual cycle is 28 days. This is if pregnancy does not occur, because if pregnancy occurs, something different happens, which we'll discuss in a minute. So if you look at A, notice that FSH stays pretty much, level throughout. However, a little more of it is generated prior to ovulation. Okay, ovulation. Let's go back. Let's talk about ovulation. So notice that ovulation occurs right at the middle of the cycle. If you look at diagram B, that's showing you what's happening inside the ovary. So to the left is the follicle, to the right is the corpus luteum, and in the middle, that's ovulation. That's when the egg is released into the fallopian tube. Okay, make sure you understand that. And if you notice, right at that point, that's where you get LH, a surge of LH from your pituitary gland. Notice that's in a diagram A. Notice that big surge of LH, the blue line there, right in the middle. So it's LH that actually causes the ovulation to occur. Notice that FSH is higher, a little bit higher before ovulation, because FSH is maintaining the follicle. All right, and then the levels of LH go back down to normal after the surge of LH. All right, and then so that's diagram A, is showing you how FSH and LH change. Just the main take-home message is that surge of LH that causes ovulation. This diagram B is showing you what's going on in the ovary, which we already discussed. So to the left is the egg developing, the follicle developing around it, then ovulation occurs, then the corpus luteum the follicle becomes the corpus luteum. That's called the luteal phase. That's what's happening in the ovary. The follicle secretes estrogen. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone. Okay, so if you notice, estrogen levels are higher right before ovulation. This is because the follicle, as it gets bigger, it's secreting more and more and more estrogen. Estrogen is still secreted afterwards, but it's just that there's more of it secreted before ovulation. Then after ovulation, progesterone becomes higher, and that is because progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum. So estrogen is secreted by the follicle, progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum. So you expect more estrogen before and more progesterone after. So estrogen helps to stimulate the thickening of the uterus, which is diagram D. That's showing you what's happening in the uterus. So at the very beginning of the cycle is when the uterus is sloughing off through the process of menstruation, and then the uterus starts to get thicker and thicker and thicker over the course of 28 days. Progesterone is what is maintaining it at that point, and it's staying thick because of the progesterone. And then once the corpus luteum dies, then the levels of progesterone drop, and once the levels of progesterone drop, the uterus can no longer be maintained, and it sloughs off. Okay, so this just kind of summarizes everything I just said, the parts that you need to know. Day 14 is the LH surge, like we discussed. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone. Progesterone enriches the uterine lining. Day 28. Without the fertilized ovum, the corpus luteum dies. Plasma levels of ovarian hormones decline. Without hormonal support, uterine lining sloughs off. So everything you need to know is in bold, and the diagram is just to help you understand it. Okay, so here's another picture, but this introduces another hormone called HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin. This is secreted actually by the developing embryo and eventually by the placenta. And it's HCG which maintains the pregnancy for the first trimester. So if fertilization occurs, the HCG tells the corpus luteum to keep producing progesterone and keep maintaining the uterine lining. So without HCG, then the menstrual cycle occurs. With HCG, the menstrual cycle does not occur, and the endometrium stays engorged with blood in order to nourish the developing embryo. So if you're not pregnant, what happens is the corpus luteum dies, the uterine lining loses hormonal support, and the cycle starts over again. If fertilization does occur, the corpus luteum remains alive, secretes progesterone and estrogen, hormones sustain the endometrium. The early embryo implants in the endometrium. HCG is secreted by the blastocyst and later by the implanted embryo, and eventually the placenta starts producing its own hormones to maintain the pregnancy. So it is that HCG that makes the difference, and it's the fact that the corpus luteum stays alive if you're pregnant and dies if you're non-pregnant. So it's that corpus luteum that really maintains the uterine lining, at least for the first trimester. Later the placenta is able to produce its own hormones. So this is only early in the cycle, early in the pregnancy. And then HCG, of course, is important in keeping the corpus luteum going. So in summary, what we've learned about in this mini lecture is you should understand some of these terms that are associated with genetics, like haploid, diploid. Haploid means half the number of DNA. Diploid means a full set of DNA. Haploid cells are, of course, the result of meiosis that only happen in the gonads. And diploid cells most of your body cells are diploid cells, and diploid cells, when they make copies of themselves through the process of mitosis, they form diploid cells again because they're just making copies of themselves. Diploid just means there's two sets of each chromosome. Chromosomes are where the DNA is. The DNA is where the genes are. Genes code for proteins. If there is a change in the DNA sequence, then there's also a change in the protein, and this can have consequences for depending on where and when the mutations occur. Health consequences. You should be aware of the term zygote, which is the first cell that's formed after fertilization when the sperm and the egg come together. You should also understand the female reproductive cycle. So looking at the diagram down there, meiosis happens in the ovaries. That's where the eggs are produced. Of course, then the follicle is produced around the egg, and then the follicle secretes estrogen, and then the egg is released into the fallopian tubes. Then the fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube, and then if fertilization occurs, of course, then the embryo is implanted in the endometrium. It's the inner part of the uterus, composed of epithelial tissue. And then if pregnancy occurs, then HCG is secreted from the developing embryo, and it tells the ovary to keep the corpus luteum alive. The corpus luteum is, of course, what the follicle turns into after ovulation, and all of this is ultimately controlled by the pituitary gland from FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Those two hormones are released from the pituitary gland, and they have different effects on the ovary, but ultimately control the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the ovary. So if you look at all your hormones, FSH and LH are secreted from the pituitary gland, Estrogen and progesterone are secreted from the ovary. HCG is secreted from the developing embryo and eventually the placenta. This concludes this mini lecture. You will have a quiz on it next time, of course, as always, and everything in here is fair game for the test.